In the blistering heat of the Syrian desert in 272 AD, thousands of Roman heavy infantrymen drove their spades into the baked earth, meticulously establishing siege lines around the wealthy oasis city of Palmyra. The relentless sun beat down on their iron armor, creating a harsh glare and a dry, biting dust that coated the veteran legions of Emperor Aurelian. This was no simple border skirmish or routine frontier patrol. The Roman Empire had fundamentally fractured, bleeding from decades of internal military disaster, and Aurelian had marched his army across the known world to surgically reattach its severed eastern limb before the entire state collapsed. Inside those towering stone walls sat Queen Zenobia, a defiant and highly capable ruler who had exploited the vulnerability of the central imperial government to carve out a massive, independent empire of her own. She had seized the wealthiest provinces of the East, including the vital grain fields of Egypt, directly challenging the authority of the Senate and the survival of the imperial administration. To restore Rome, Aurelian could not accept a negotiated peace. He had to entirely dismantle her military and political power structure. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today we break down the brutal logistics, the precise desert tactics, and the ruthless command decisions that allowed Rome to crush the breakaway Palmyrene Empire. We will examine how a hardened Illyrian commander outmaneuvered a wealthy commercial superpower, forcing a decisive confrontation at the edge of the known world. Aurelian had the finest heavy infantry in the world, but to take Palmyra, he had to conquer an enemy far more lethal than the rebel queen's cavalry, the vast, unforgiving desert itself. The geopolitical earthquake that ultimately brought Aurelian to the desert sands began 12 years earlier, in 260 AD. In an event that shattered the psychological foundation of the Roman world, Emperor Valerian was defeated and captured alive by the Sassanid Persian king Shapur I. The unprecedented reality of a Roman emperor enslaved by a foreign power paralyzed the imperial administration and created a catastrophic power vacuum. Stripped of its supreme commander and bleeding from decades of economic instability, the Roman Empire physically broke apart. In the west, the provinces of Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania seceded to form the independent Gallic Empire. In the center, a succession of embattled emperors desperately tried to hold Italy and the Danubian frontier together. The wealthy eastern provinces were left entirely exposed to Persian aggression, effectively severed from the protection of the regular legions. Into this void stepped Odenathus, the ruler of the wealthy caravan city of Palmyra. Initially, Odenathus acted as the ultimate loyal ally to the Roman state. Leveraging his city's immense commercial wealth and highly mobile desert cavalry, he took it upon himself to defend the eastern frontier. He systematically drove the Sassanid armies back across the Euphrates River, stabilizing a region the imperial government could no longer protect. For his service, Rome granted him unprecedented titles, recognizing him as the supreme commander of the East. However, the stability of the frontier was abruptly shattered when Odenathus was mysteriously assassinated in 267 AD, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the Syrian desert. Control of Palmyra and its battle-hardened army fell to his widow, Queen Zenobia, acting as regent for her young son, Vabilathus. Zenobia was a highly educated, pragmatic, and fiercely ambitious political operator. She analyzed the fractured Roman state and recognized that the central imperial government was too consumed by Germanic incursions and internal usurpers to project force into the east. Under her command, Palmyra rapidly transitioned from a loyal client state into an opportunistic, independent power center. She absorbed the surrounding Roman provinces, leveraging the vast wealth generated by the Silk Road trade routes to buy the loyalty of local garrisons and build a massive, sophisticated military force. For a brief period, Aurelian's predecessors tolerated this arrangement, forced by necessity to let Zenobia govern the east so long as the borders remained secure and the Persian threat was kept at bay. The Senate in Rome maintained the polite fiction that Zenobia and her son were merely managing the eastern provinces on behalf of the emperor. But protecting the frontier was no longer enough for the ambitious queen. Soon, she would cast her eyes on the very lifeblood of the Roman state. The impending collision between Rome and Palmyra was not just a territorial dispute, it was a fundamental clash of military doctrines and leadership styles. On one side stood Emperor Aurelian, a man forged entirely in the brutal crucible of the Danubian frontier. Unlike the aristocratic senators of previous centuries, Aurelian was a hardened Illyrian cavalry commander who had ruthlessly clawed his way up from the rank and file. He possessed no patience for courtly diplomacy or political theater. His singular focus was the survival of the state through absolute military efficiency. He commanded the battle-tested Danubian legions, a veteran heavy infantry force that had spent decades holding back incursions in the freezing mud of the northern borders. These men were the iron core of the Roman military machine, deeply loyal to a supreme commander who fought alongside them and punished disciplinary failures with uncompromising severity. Opposing this grim Roman pragmatism was Queen Zenobia, a ruler who understood that in the ancient world, ultimate power was often purchased rather than inherited. Zenobia was not a mystical figure of Eastern legend, but a highly educated, cunning, and pragmatic political operator. She presided over a glittering intellectual court in Palmyra, funded directly by the immense profits of the Silk Road trade. The heavy rhythmic clinking of foreign coins being counted in Palmyrene treasuries allowed her to sustain a massive standing army without relying on the collapsing Roman economy. Her capital had become a commercial superpower, acting as the vital artery connecting the Mediterranean world to the luxury goods of Persia and India. This staggering financial leverage allowed her to buy the allegiance of local garrisons, effectively privatizing Rome's eastern defense apparatus under her own banner. With this wealth, Zenobia and her supreme field commander, Zabdas, constructed a military machine explicitly designed to exploit the vast, arid geography of the Syrian desert. They did not rely on the slow-moving, heavy infantry traditional to Mediterranean warfare. Instead, the Palmyrene army was built around the sheer kinetic power of the Clibonari, heavily armored shock cavalry, where both rider and horse were entirely encased in overlapping iron-scale armor that reflected the harsh desert sun with a blinding glare. These armored juggernauts were supported by swarms of highly mobile desert archers capable of bleeding an enemy from a distance before the cataphracts delivered a shattering close-quarters charge. It was a fluid, lethal force perfectly adapted to the open plains of the East, presenting a terrifying tactical puzzle for any Western army marching into their domain. Aurelian recognized the lethal asymmetry of this matchup. His heavy infantry excelled in disciplined, static defense and aggressive forward pushes, but they would be operating thousands of miles from home, highly vulnerable to starvation and cavalry harassment in the open wasteland. Yet, the emperor understood that the imperial government could not survive without its eastern revenues. Aurelian knew that to break Zenobia's power, he could not simply wait in Rome. He had to march his legions directly into the jaws of her war machine. The fragile diplomatic fiction between Rome and Palmyra shattered completely in the autumn of 270 AD. Recognizing that the imperial government was temporarily paralyzed by Gothic incursions in Europe, Zenobia dispatched her supreme field commander, Zabdas, to march a massive Palmyrene army south into Egypt. This invasion was not a routine border dispute. It was a calculated, lethal strike at the physical jugular of the Roman state. Egypt functioned as the primary breadbasket of the empire, generating immense agricultural surpluses and critical tax revenues. Without the massive grain fleets sailing regularly from Alexandria to the port of Ostia, the population of Rome would starve within a matter of months. The resulting urban riots would paralyze the Senate and permanently cripple the imperial administration. By conquering the Nile Valley and securing its ports, Zenobia effectively placed a chokehold on the daily survival of the central government, weaponizing logistics to force Rome into submission. This military aggression was swiftly followed by the ultimate act of political treason. In 271 AD, Zenobia formally dropped all pretense of Roman allegiance. She ceased recognizing Aurelian as the sovereign power and elevated her young son, Vaballathus, to the supreme title of Augustus, or Emperor of Rome, while claiming the title of Augusta for herself. To cement this usurpation, the captured mints in Alexandria and Antioch began striking new coinage bearing her son's profile, crowned with the imperial diadem, conspicuously erasing Aurelian's image from the currency. In the highly symbolic political structure of the ancient world, striking unauthorized coinage was not merely an insult, it was the definitive declaration of a rival empire. Zenobia had drawn a line in the sand that could only be washed away with blood. For Aurelian, the geopolitical reality required no prolonged debate within the Senate. The immediate loss of the Egyptian grain supply dictated a total and immediate war of reclamation. Stripping his European garrisons down to their bare minimum, the emperor rapidly mobilized his battle-hardened Danubian legions for a massive counteroffensive. The heavy, synchronized crunch of thousands of iron hobnailed boots striking the paved Roman highways echoed across the provinces as the vanguard marched relentlessly toward Asia Minor. Aurelian bypassed standard logistical delays, driving his heavy infantry forward with a terrifying momentum designed to shock the eastern defenders before they could fortify their new borders. He intended to systematically dismantle the rebellion, city by city, pushing ever closer to the heart of the desert. Zenobia believed the brutal Syrian terrain would exhaust the Roman legions long before they reached her. But she severely underestimated the ruthless engineering of Aurelian's advance. Aurelian's rapid march brought his veteran legions into Syria by the early summer of 272 AD, directly confronting the outer defensive ring of the Palmyrene Empire, near the metropolis of Antioch. Field Commander Zabdas was waiting on the flat plains of Ime, ground he had deliberately selected to provide a perfect, unobstructed runway for his Clibanarii, the fully armored shock cavalry that served as the iron core of Zenobia's war machine. A conventional commander might have formed a heavy infantry square and braced for impact, trusting in raw discipline to absorb the kinetic shock. Aurelian, however, recognized that allowing heavy cavalry to dictate the momentum of the engagement on an open plain was tactical suicide. He refused to provide the enemy with a static target. Instead of anchoring a solid defensive line, the emperor deployed his light Dalmatian and Moorish cavalry with a highly specific operational directive. They were ordered to aggressively provoke the Palmyrene lines, but strictly forbidden from locking into close quarters combat. The moment Zabdas unleashed his cataphracts, the Roman horsemen instantly wheeled their mounts and fled. To the Palmyrene command, this appeared to be a catastrophic break in Roman discipline, a disorganized rout before the battle had even truly begun. Confident in his absolute superiority, Zabdas ordered a full-scale pursuit, driving his heavy cavalry forward to run down the fleeing imperial troops. This was exactly the trap Aurelian had engineered. The chase extended for miles across the arid scrubland, deliberately pushing the massive Palmyrene war horses to their absolute physical limits. In this pursuit, the environment quickly became a lethal adversary. Beneath their overlapping layers of iron-scale armor, the heat grew suffocating, trapping the searing Syrian temperature against the skin of both the riders and their heavily armored mounts. The sheer exertion of a prolonged gallop while carrying hundreds of pounds of metal steadily drained the momentum from the charge. As the sun climbed higher, the terrifying formation of cataphracts began to fracture, their horses staggering and foaming with severe exhaustion. Sensing that the enemy's kinetic energy was entirely spent, the retreating Roman light cavalry abruptly halted and turned their mounts. The tactical reversal was immediate and devastating. Unburdened by heavy armor, the fresh Roman cavalry drove their lances into the exhausted Clibanarii, who could no longer maneuver their blown horses or generate the speed necessary for a countercharge. Zabdas's elite striking force was systematically dismantled near Ime, completely neutralized by targeted exhaustion and tactical deception. the surviving Palmyrene forces abandoned Antioch and fled south. Unwilling to concede the Levant, Queen Zenobia and Zabdis fell back to the city of Emesa, leveraging their vast commercial wealth to rapidly assemble a second massive field army of approximately 70,000 men. Aurelian maintained his relentless pursuit, forcing a second major engagement on the plains outside the city walls. This time, the Palmyrenes adapted their approach. When the battle commenced, the sheer weight and ferocity of the Palmyrene cavalry charge successfully shattered the Roman cavalry wings, driving the imperial horsemen entirely off the battlefield. For a brief moment, it appeared Zenobia's forces had secured a decisive tactical victory. However, by blindly pursuing the routing Roman cavalry, the Palmyrene horsemen detached themselves from their own infantry support and exposed their flanks to Aurelian's veteran center. The emperor immediately ordered his heavy infantry cohorts to wheel outward and envelop the isolated cataphracts. To counter the impenetrable iron-scale armor of the enemy, Aurelian deployed specialized Palestinian auxiliary units armed entirely with heavy iron-studded clubs. While Roman short swords frequently glanced off the interlocking metal plates, blunt force weapons bypassed the armor entirely. The massive clubs delivered shattering kinetic impacts, crushing ribs and breaking the bones of the horses beneath the iron shells without needing to pierce them. The elite Palmyrene cavalry was violently bludgeoned into the dirt, transforming a localized breakthrough into a catastrophic operational collapse. Field Commander Zabdis and Queen Zenobia had lost their elite field army, leaving them with only one option: a desperate retreat across 100 miles of barren wasteland to their heavily fortified capital. The retreat of the surviving Palmyrene forces pulled Aurelian into the most perilous phase of the campaign. To reach the rebel capital, the Roman legions had to traverse nearly 100 miles of the unforgiving Syrian desert. In this barren expanse, the primary antagonist was no longer enemy cavalry, but the physical environment itself. Sustaining a war machine of roughly 50,000 heavy infantrymen, along with their cavalry mounts, siege engineers, and thousands of draft animals, required a staggering daily intake of water and grain. The logistical tether stretching back to the conquered city of Emesa was dangerously long and highly exposed. As the Roman column crawled eastward, they were subjected to relentless harassment by independent Bedouin tribes allied with Zenobia. These desert nomads struck the vulnerable baggage trains without warning, using their deep knowledge of the arid landscape to vanish into the shimmering heat haze before Roman cavalry could mount an effective pursuit. Aurelian recognized that a static defense of his supply lines would inevitably bleed his army to death before they ever reached the city walls. He needed to alter the geopolitical geometry of the desert. Rather than fighting an endless war of attrition against ghosts in the sand, the emperor leveraged the sheer weight of Roman authority combined with the promise of imperial gold. Through aggressive diplomacy and a calculated display of uncompromising military force, Aurelian systematically flipped the allegiance of the local Bedouin chieftains. The tactical transition was immediate and devastating for Palmyra. The very tribes that had been bleeding the Roman supply chains now became their primary provisioners, bringing steady shipments of water, grain, and livestock to the advancing legions. More crucially, Aurelian directed these nomads to sever Palmyra's own regional supply lines, perfectly isolating the rebel capital from the outside world. Upon arriving at the oasis city, the Roman engineering apparatus went to work with cold, mechanical efficiency. Palmyra was a formidable fortress, heavily stocked with immense reserves of food and water, surrounded by thick defensive walls designed specifically to withstand a prolonged blockade. Aurelian did not order a rash, high-casualty frontal assault. Instead, his legions dug in, constructing a suffocating ring of circumvallation around the city limits. Deep trenches were excavated, and heavy timber palisades were erected to permanently seal the defenders inside. The perimeter was heavily reinforced with Roman artillery. The deep, rhythmic thud of torsion ballistae driving massive stone projectiles and iron-tipped bolts against the city's fortifications became a constant, demoralizing reminder of the trap closing around the rebel queen. Inside the walls, Queen Zenobia remained defiant, anchoring her survival on a grand strategic calculation. She knew the Roman army was operating at the absolute limit of its geographical reach. Her primary objective was simply to hold the walls and outlast Aurelian supplies while waiting for a massive relief force from the Sassanid Persian Empire. A Persian military intervention would instantly trap the Roman legions between the heavily fortified city and a fresh enemy field army, fracturing Aurelian's command and forcing a catastrophic Roman retreat. But the Sassanid monarch, Shapur I, had recently died, leaving the Persian court entangled in a complex succession crisis. The overwhelming relief force that Zenobia so desperately required was never authorized to cross the Euphrates. As weeks turned into months, the harsh arithmetic of the siege shifted violently against Palmyra. The Roman supply lines, secured by the allied Bedouin, remained unbroken, while the city's vast reserves slowly began to evaporate under the immense strain of feeding both the civilian population and the surviving military garrison. As the Roman siege engines battered the walls and the promised Persian army failed to materialize, Zenobia realized the city would fall, and she made a final, desperate gamble in the dead of night. Under the cover of darkness, Zenobia and a small cadre of her highest-ranking advisors successfully slipped through the perimeter of the Roman circumvallation. Abandoning the slow, heavy pageantry of her royal court, the queen mounted a swift dromedary camel, initiating a desperate, high-speed race across the eastern sands. Her objective was the Euphrates River, the traditional geopolitical boundary separating the Roman and Persian spheres of influence. The physical toll of the journey was immense, but the dromedary offered unparalleled endurance and velocity in the arid wasteland, allowing the fugitives to quickly put miles between themselves and the besieged capital. When dawn broke and Roman sentries reported that the primary target had breached the lines, Aurelian did not hesitate. He immediately detached his fastest light cavalry units with strict orders to ride the fugitives down before they could reach the water. This pursuit was not merely about capturing a defecting ruler. It was a high-stakes race to prevent an imperial catastrophe. If Zenobia successfully crossed the Euphrates and presented herself at the Sassanid court, she would undoubtedly offer Palmyra's permanent submission to Persia in exchange for a royal army. Such a diplomatic maneuver would instantly escalate a regional secession into a devastating international conflict. Aurelian's exhausted legions, currently anchored to the logistical burden of the siege, would suddenly find themselves facing the combined, fresh might of the Persian war machine and the remaining Palmyrene garrisons. To prevent a catastrophic multi-front war that the fractured Roman state physically could not survive, the queen had to be intercepted on the western bank at all costs. The Roman pursuit was relentless, pushing their cavalry mounts to the absolute edge of muscular failure to close the gap. Just as Zenobia reached the muddy, slow-moving currents of the Euphrates and prepared to board a small transport boat that would ferry her to permanent asylum, the imperial horsemen finally overtook her. There was no grand, romanticized last stand on the riverbank. It was a cold, precise military interception. The Roman cavalry systematically secured the perimeter, cutting off all avenues of maritime escape and taking the queen and her inner circle into custody without a protracted skirmish. By physically removing the head of the command structure, Aurelian executed a surgical strike that permanently neutralized the political will of the breakaway empire. When the news of Zenobia's capture filtered back across the desert and reached the defenders manning the walls of Palmyra, the psychological foundation of their resistance evaporated. Bereft of their monarch, their supreme commander, and the lingering hope of foreign intervention, the city's remaining elites made a swift, pragmatic calculation. They ordered the massive gates opened and formally surrendered the commercial capital to Emperor Aurelian, successfully sparing the city from a brutal infantry assault and a subsequent bloody sack. The rebel queen was finally in Roman hands, but the punishment for her treason would ignite a second, far more fatal crisis for her wealthy capital. Aurelian transported his royal captive to the city of Emesa to establish absolute legal dominance over the fractured East. The resulting trial was a masterclass in ruthless political calculus. Standing before the imperial tribunal, Zenobia, facing execution for high treason, shifted the blame for the rebellion entirely onto her inner circle, explicitly pointing to her chief counselor, the renowned philosopher Cassius Longinus. Aurelian understood the geopolitical value of his prisoners. He deliberately spared the queen's life, preserving her as the ultimate living trophy for the triumph he intended to hold in the capital. However, to permanently break the intellectual and administrative backbone of the Palmyrene state, he ordered the immediate execution of Longinus and the rest of the high-ranking advisors. The swift, metallic severing of their heads by the executioner's blade served as a brutal demonstration of restored imperial authority. Believing the region was thoroughly pacified, the emperor garrisoned Palmyra with a contingent of 600 Roman archers under the command of an officer named Sandarian, and rapidly marched his veteran legions back toward Europe to address new Germanic incursions along the Danube. But the surviving merchant elites of Palmyra, humiliated by the occupation and desperate to reclaim their lost commercial monopolies, severely misjudged Aurelian's patience. In 273 AD, a sudden and violent secondary revolt erupted within the city walls. The local faction systematically slaughtered Sandarian and his entire Roman garrison, foolishly elevating a minor nobleman named Antiochus to the purple. It was an act of political suicide. The rebels assumed the Roman emperor was too deeply entangled in European border wars to reverse his march and mount a second grueling desert campaign. They were entirely wrong. Upon receiving word of the garrison's massacre, Aurelian instantly wheeled his legions around. His marching speed was terrifying, driven by an unyielding focus and absolute logistical discipline. Without pausing to establish extensive supply depots or negotiate with local tribes, the imperial army crossed the Syrian desert and appeared before the gates of Palmyra before the rebels could even organize a coherent defense. This time, there would be no prolonged siege, no diplomatic envoys, and no mercy. Aurelian unleashed the full, unrestrained violence of the Roman military machine upon the city. The destruction of Palmyra was not a passionate, chaotic sack. It was a cold, strategic eradication designed to ensure the eastern provinces would never rise again. The heavy infantry systematically dismantled the towering defensive walls, breached the temples, and stripped the city of its immense accumulated wealth. Plunder was hauled out by the wagon load, while the physical infrastructure that had sustained the silk and spice trade was methodically broken. Thick, dark columns of smoke from burning storehouses marked the definitive end of Palmyra's status as a commercial superpower. The surviving population was dispersed, and the once glittering oasis was left in absolute ruin. Palmyra was reduced to a ghost town in the sand, but Aurelian still had to prove to the citizens of Rome that the empire had truly been made whole again. In 274 AD, the streets of Rome bore witness to a spectacle of political theater designed to permanently erase the humiliation of the past decade. Aurelian staged a triumph of staggering proportions, parading the spoils of the reconquered East before the Senate and the Roman populace. At the center of this monumental procession was Queen Zenobia herself. She was not dragged in iron rags. Instead, Aurelian bound her in heavy, ornate golden chains, so massive that she required the assistance of Roman guards simply to walk under their exhausting weight. This was a calculated psychological weapon. By presenting the rebel queen dripping in the very riches she had used to fund her treason, the emperor demonstrated an absolute geopolitical truth. The infinite commercial wealth of the East had ultimately been subdued by the unforgiving iron of the Western legions. Zenobia's life was spared, and she would spend her remaining years living quietly in an Italian villa. But her presence in the triumph symbolized the definitive death of her independent empire. With the eastern frontier secured and the grain shipments from Alexandria flowing once again into the port of Ostia, Aurelian immediately turned his war machine toward Europe. Before the year ended, he marched his veteran heavy infantry against the Gallic Empire, confronting the breakaway forces of Tetricus. Facing the same disciplined juggernaut that had just crossed the Syrian desert and dismantled Palmyra, the Western usurper surrendered almost immediately. In less than 5 years of relentless campaigning, Aurelian had achieved the impossible. He had stitched the fractured halves of the Roman world back onto its central axis. Recognizing the magnitude of this military salvation, the Senate bestowed upon him a title that no other commander could claim: Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. Aurelian's reign was brutally short. Just a year after his grand triumph, he would be assassinated by his own officers in 275 AD, the victim of a forged document and military paranoia. Yet, the strategic legacy of his eastern campaigns altered the trajectory of human history. The crisis of the 3rd century had nearly extinguished the Roman state, threatening to permanently divide Europe, Africa, and Asia into competing warlord kingdoms. By systematically dismantling the Palmyrene war machine and dragging its queen back to the capital in chains, Aurelian prevented a permanent geopolitical fracture. He proved that the lethal combination of hostile desert geography and well-funded rebellion could still be broken by the raw structural discipline of the legions and the uncompromising focus of a singular commander. The empire survived its darkest century, buying the Roman administration the time needed to reform and endure for hundreds of years to come. Please subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.